I never thought moving into a quiet suburban neighborhood would turn into one of the biggest battles of my life. When my sister and I bought a house together, it was supposed to be a new beginning for her. She had recently gone through some health issues that left her dependent on a wheelchair, and the place we found seemed perfect: wide driveway, a good-sized yard, and a home we could finally call our own. The first thing we did after moving in was build a wheelchair ramp so my sister could easily get in and out of the house. It wasn't anything fancy, just a sturdy, safe wooden ramp designed by a professional contractor who followed every AIDA guideline to the letter. I thought it was just a basic necessity. My sister deserved independence, and I wasn't about to let her struggle every single day with stairs. But almost immediately, the HOA came knocking. At first, it was just a polite letter slipped into our mailbox. They claimed the ramp did not conform to the aesthetic standards of the community, and that it had to be removed or modified. I remember reading it out loud to my sister, and she just looked at me with this mix of frustration and disbelief. She said, "Are they really saying my accessibility is ugly?" I figured it was a misunderstanding. So I reached out, sent them all the permits, ADA compliance documents, and even photographs of other ramps in neighborhoods around town. I explained it wasn't just a preference, it was the law. They didn't care. In fact, their response was cold and dismissive. They said the ramp violated community guidelines and was unsightly. That's when things started to escalate. Every week, we got another letter. Then came fines: $50, $100, $200. They piled up like they were trying to bleed us dry. HOA board members even started showing up outside the house, taking pictures of the ramp as if it was some kind of criminal evidence. I caught one of them once, crouching down like a paparazzi, snapping shots of the nails and the slope angle. My sister was heartbroken. That ramp was her freedom. She could finally roll out onto the porch, feel the breeze, greet the neighbors without waiting for me or anyone else to help her. And now these people were trying to take it away because they didn't think it looked pretty enough. One day, the HOA president showed up in person. A tall, balding man with sunglasses too big for his face, standing there like he owned the whole block. He didn't even knock. He just rang the bell and started lecturing me about community standards the moment I opened the door. I tried to reason with him, but he wouldn't hear it. He kept repeating, "The ramp has to go." End of discussion. My sister wheeled herself over and told him directly, "This is my home. I have a right to access it safely." "Are you really telling me you'd rather I crawl up the stairs than use a ramp?" He didn't flinch. He just muttered something about rules are rules and walked off like he'd won. That night, my sister cried. I hadn't seen her break down like that in months. She said it felt like they weren't just attacking her ramp, they were attacking her dignity. That's when I knew this fight wasn't going to be simple. These people weren't just stubborn, they were ruthless. And then came the day I'll never forget. I was at work when my phone rang. It was one of our neighbors, whispering frantically, "You need to get home. They're tearing down your sister's ramp." I raced back as fast as I could, and when I pulled up, there it was, a bulldozer in our driveway, planks of wood scattered across the lawn, and a crew working under the watchful eye of the HOA president. They had actually brought in heavy machinery to destroy a wheelchair ramp without notice, without permission, without a shred of humanity. My sister was sitting inside, watching through the window, trembling with anger and heartbreak. She kept saying, "They can't do this to me." Can't. But they did. What the HOA didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that my sister wasn't just any homeowner. She wasn't just a woman in a wheelchair trying to live her life. She was the governor of the state, the very person whose office controlled the flow of funds and grants that the HOA relied on to keep their little kingdom running. And by bulldozing her ramp, they had just bulldozed their own future. When I walked into the living room that day, My sister was staring at the mess outside like she was frozen in time. Pieces of wood lay scattered all over the lawn, nails glinting in the sun. The slope that once gave her independence, now just a jagged pile of wreckage. She looked at me with tears in her eyes, but behind that sadness, there was something else, in anger that was quietly boiling into something much stronger. I stormed outside, shouting at the HOA president. He stood there, arms crossed, smug as ever, with that bulldozer parked like some trophy behind him. "This is private property," I yelled. "You had no right to touch that ramp." He smirked and waved a clipboard in my face. "We have the authority to remove any unapproved structure in the neighborhood. You were given warnings. You ignored them. Consider this your final notice." I wanted to rip that clipboard out of his hands, but then I saw my sister rolling toward the door, her face set in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. She pushed the door open and wheeled herself out onto the porch, well, what was left of it without the ramp. She was inches from the edge, but she didn't care. "You think you're powerful," she said, her voice steady but sharp. "You think because you have a board and a few bylaws that you can dictate people's lives. But you just made the biggest mistake of yours?" The president laughed. Actually laughed. He turned to the crew and said, "Pack it up, boys. Job's done." Then he leaned closer to her and whispered loud enough for me to hear, "If you don't like it, move." That was it. That was the spark. Later that night, I found my sister in her office, her laptop open, phone in hand, typing furiously. Her tears were gone. She was calm, almost frighteningly calm. She looked at me and said, "They think I'm powerless. Let's show them what powerless really looks like." See? What the HOA didn't know was that my sister wasn't just a regular homeowner. They had bulldozed the property of the sitting governor of the state. She hadn't exactly advertised it when we moved in. She wanted to live like everyone else, no political entourage, no flashing lights, just a home where she could breathe. But now, their arrogance had forced her hand. The next morning, she made a few phone calls. I don't know who she spoke to first, but within hours, there were state inspectors on our street. They walked around with clipboards, snapping pictures not of our ramp, but of the HOA's common areas. The pool, the clubhouse, the sidewalks, the parking lot. I watched from the porch as the HOA president ran out of his house, looking pale. He tried to sweet-talk the inspectors, but they ignored him. One of them even asked him directly, "Do you have ADA compliance reports on file for your community facilities?" His face went blank. By noon, word had spread around the neighborhood. Neighbors came out of their houses whispering to each other, watching the inspectors comb through every detail of the HOA's property. The smug president, who had laughed at my sister, was now sweating bullets in his driveway. But my sister wasn't finished. Not even close. That evening, she held a meeting in our living room. Yes, our living room. She invited neighbors, people who had been quietly fed up with the HOA for years, but too scared to speak out. They trickled in, one by one, until our house was packed. Some stood, some sat on the floor, all of them buzzing with curiosity. My sister wheeled to the center of the room and spoke, not as their neighbor, but as the governor. She explained what had happened, how the HOA had violated not only her rights, but federal law by destroying a wheelchair ramp. She told them about the ADA, about housing protections, about funds the HOA had been receiving from state grants. Then, she dropped the bombshell: those grants, those funds, every dime the HOA depended on, had to pass through her office for approval. You could hear the collective gasp. One woman shouted, "You mean? They've been bullying us all this time, and you actually have the power to stop them?" My sister nodded. I didn't want to bring politics into this neighborhood, but they brought it to me, and now it's time for accountability. The room erupted in applause. For the first time, I saw the neighbors stand tall, no longer afraid of the board. And I saw the flicker of a plan forming in my sister's ease, a plan to dismantle the HOA's stranglehold once and for all. And that's when the real war began. The very next day, the HOA board called an emergency meeting at the clubhouse. Normally, these meetings were closed off, guarded like some secret society. But this time, something was different. Word had spread that my sister, our governor, wasn't backing down. Half the neighborhood showed up, crowding outside the glass doors, demanding to be heard. I went with my sister. She rolled in calmly, head held high, while the board members looked like they were about to face a firing squad. The president was there, pacing in front of the long table like a caged animal. He tried to look confident, but his voice cracked. When he said, "This is a private board meeting. Only members of the board are allowed," my sister didn't even blink. As a homeowner and as governor of this state, I'm here to make sure my rights and the rights of every person in this community are respected. If you don't want the homeowners here, then maybe it's time the homeowners knew exactly what you're hiding. The murmurs from the crowd outside grew louder. People pressed against the glass, waiting. The board members exchanged nervous glances. They couldn't stop her, and they knew it. So my sister began. She laid out everything, the ADA violations, the harassment, the destruction of the ramp. Then she shifted gears and pulled out something none of us expected: financial reports. She had gotten her hands on state grant records tied to this HOA, and what she revealed was jaw-dropping, according to her documents. The HOA had been receiving thousands in state funds for community improvements over the last 5 years. Money meant for sidewalk repairs, playground upgrades, accessibility renovations. But none of those projects had been completed. The sidewalks were cracked, the playground rusted, the clubhouse barely maintained. So where had the money gone? Sister looked each board member in the eye. You've been pocketing funds, haven't you? Using state money while bullying your residents. You destroyed a legally protected structure while stealing from the very people you claim to serve. The president slammed his hand on the table. That's a lie, he barked. But his voice wavered. The homeowners outside gasped and whispered among themselves. One man from the crowd shouted, "That's why our HOA dues keep going up, but nothing ever gets fixed." Another yelled, "We want an audit." It was chaos. The board tried to gavel the meeting back into order, but the homeowners had found their courage. Years of pent-up frustration poured out. People began listing every petty fine, every unfair demand, every humiliation at the hands of the HOA. It was like a floodgate had burst. And then, Cormy, my sister, made her move. As governor, I'm ordering a full audit of this HOA. Their state funding will be frozen immediately pending investigation. And as a homeowner, I will personally pursue civil action for the destruction of my property. The president went pale. The other board members looked like they wanted to vanish into their chairs. Some tried to argue, but their voices were drowned out by cheers from the crowd. When we left that night, neighbors followed us out like we were leading a parade. People patted my sister on the shoulder, thanking her, promising to stand with her. For once, the community wasn't afraid of the board, they were united against them. But the HOA wasn't finished yet. That same week, strange things started happening. Anonymous letters appeared in our mailbox, threatening to make life miserable for my sister if she didn't back down. Someone left nails scattered across our driveway. A neighbor told us they'd seen board members whispering with the bulldozer crew in the middle of the night. It was clear the HOA was desperate. And desperate people can be dangerous. But what they didn't understand was that my sister wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person in that neighborhood, and she wasn't backing down, not when justice was on the line. The first sign that the HOA was starting to unravel came the following Monday morning. I woke up to the sound of shouting outside. When I looked through the blinds, I saw two of the board members in a heated argument on the clubhouse steps. All papers were flying, neighbors were gathering. And the president was nowhere in sight. It didn't take long for the gossip to reach us. The board was divided. Some wanted to lawyer up and fight my sister tooth and nail. Others wanted to resign before the audit exposed their names on misused checks. The fear was setting in, and it was tearing them apart from the inside. Meanwhile, my sister wasn't slowing down. She had already filed an official complaint for a DA violation and property destruction, attaching photos of the bulldozer tearing down the ramp. She also requested a federal investigation since accessibility rights were a matter of federal law. Within days, the HOA found themselves buried under letters from lawyers and investigators. But the retaliation from their side only grew nastier. One evening, as I was taking out the trash, I noticed spray paint on our garage door. The word "quit" scrawled in red letters. My sister saw it too. Instead of crying, she just smiled coldly and said, "They're digging their own grave." A few nights later, we heard loud bangs, firecrackers thrown onto our lawn. Neighbors rushed out, yelling at the shadows running down the street. Was intimidation pure and simple? But instead of scaring us, it only made the community angrier. People started leaving porch lights on at night, keeping watch, protecting one another. The HOA's grip on fear was slipping. The audit results came back quicker than anyone expected, and they were worse than even my sister had predicted. Tens of thousands of dollars in state funds were unaccounted for. Maintenance contracts had been signed with phantom companies that didn't exist. Checks written to board members, relatives for consulting services. The president's own name appeared next to multiple large withdrawals labeled community improvement. The day the results were announced, the neighborhood transformed. People were on their lawns, waving the audit papers in the air, shouting for resignations. The board tried to downplay it, claiming it was a clerical mix-up, but no one was buying it. Not after the ramp. Not after the threats. Then came the breaking point. Local news stations picked up the story. Cameras showed up at the neighborhood entrance, reporters knocking on doors. Headlines blared. Governor's wheelchair ramp destroyed by HOA audit reveals misuse of funds in suburban community. The HOA president tried to avoid the cameras, but one crew caught him stumbling into his car. When they asked him about the missing money, he snapped, "No comment," and sped off like a man being chased. The more he ran, the guiltier he looked. And then, almost poetically, the very next morning, the same bulldozer crew that had destroyed my sister's ramp showed up again, this time, not at our house, but at the clubhouse. Only they weren't there to tear something down. They were there under court order to seize HOA property as part of the Wong investigation. The sight of a bulldozer parked in front of the HOA's pride and joy, the clubhouse they lorded over us, was like watching justice take physical form. Neighbors gathered with lawn chairs just to watch. Someone even brought popcorn. Through all of this, my sister remained calm, almost serene. She told me, "This isn't about revenge anymore. It's about showing them that power only works when people let fear silence them." But as much as the community was celebrating, I couldn't shake the feeling that the HOA president wasn't done yet. He was too proud, too arrogant to accept defeat. And sure enough, he made one last desperate move, a move that would end up being the final nail in his coffin. It was a Friday evening when my sister received a thick envelope slipped under our front door. No return address, no explanation. Inside were legal papers, an emergency injunction filed by the HOA, claiming she had abused her position as governor. To illegally target the HOA, the president had somehow scraped together a lawyer willing to throw mud in the water, hoping to paint himself as the victim. When I read through the documents, I couldn't help but laugh. They were riddled with exaggerations, half-truths, and wild claims that my sister had personally ordered a smear campaign against the HOA. The audacity of it was almost unbelievable. But my sister didn't laugh. She studied the papers carefully, then set them down and said, "Good. This is exactly what I wanted." I frowned. "You wanted this?" She nodded. "Now, it won't just be an audit or a neighborhood fight. Now, it will go to court. And once it does, everything they've done will be on public record for the entire state to see." And she was right. The court date came quickly, thanks to her office's involvement. By then, the news coverage had exploded. Cameras lined the courthouse steps. Neighbors held signs supporting my sister and the once feared HOA board members shuffled in looking like school children sent to the principal's office. The president still wore his smug expression, but even he couldn't hide the sweat beading on his forehead. Inside, the judge didn't waste any time. My sister's lawyers laid out the facts: the destruction of a legally mandated wheelchair ramp, the ADA violations, the harassment, the threats, and finally, the damning results of the audit. Piece by piece, the HOA's empire of arrogance crumbled right there in the courtroom. When the president's lawyer tried to argue that my sister had abused her power, the judge raised an eyebrow and asked, "So, you destroyed a disabled resident's wheelchair ramp and misused state funds, and you're saying she's the one abusing power?" The entire courtroom burst into laughter. The verdict was swift. The HOA was ordered to pay for the full reconstruction of my sister's ramp, this time with state oversight to ensure it was ADA compliant. They were fined heavily for violations, and several board members, including the president, were referred for criminal investigation for fraud and misuse of funds. The president himself was removed from his position, banned from serving on any HOA board in the state again. The day we came home from court, neighbors gathered in our yard with cheers, food, and music. Someone even wheeled out a barbecue grill. It wasn't just a victory for us, it was freedom for the whole neighborhood. A week later, contractors arrived to rebuild my sister's ramp. This time, it wasn't just a wooden slope. It was a beautiful, sturdy structure with railings, lighting, and a smooth gradient. My sister rolled down it for the first time with tears in her eyes, but this time, they were tears of joy. She looked at me and said, "They tried to take away my independence. Instead, they gave me the chance to protect everyone else's." And the HOA. It was dissolved within months. With the president disgraced and the funds frozen, the community voted to shut it down permanently. For the first time in years, neighbors could decorate their yards how they wanted, host gatherings without fines, and live without fear of harassment. As for my sister, her quiet life as just another neighbor was gone. But something bigger had taken its place. She had become a symbol, not just of authority, but of resilience and justice. People stopped her on the street to thank her. Parents brought their kids to meet her, saying, "This is the woman who stood up to the HOA and me." I'll never forget the lesson I learned through it all. Power doesn't come from titles or positions. It comes from standing up when others are too scared, from refusing to let injustice slide. The HOA thought they could bulldoze a ramp and bulldoze a woman's dignity. Instead, they bulldozed themselves straight into oblivion. So the next time you hear about an HOA throwing its weight around, remember this: they may control the bylaws, but they don't control the people. And sometimes, all it takes is one act of arrogance to awaken the kind of justice they never saw coming. Because in our neighborhood, the ramp they tore down became the ramp that tore them down.